when the quiet of an early morning was shattered on January 28, 2024, by a drone's deadly strike on Tower 22, a remote military outpost nestled at the strategic crossroads of Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. The world was jolted awake. 3 army reservists from Georgia fell victim to this surprise assault, while around 40 others sustained injuries. The Islamic Resistance in Iraq, an umbrella for various Islamist factions with ties to Iran, stepped forward to claim this bold attack, though Iran washed its hands of the matter. The US response was swift and decisive, launching a retaliatory strike on February 3rd. But what led to this clash in the shadowy corners of the Middle East, and did America's countermove hit its mark? Before diving into the heart of this conflict, let's zoom in on Tower 22, home to 350 valiant American troops, and unravel the complex web of geopolitical tensions that set the stage for that fateful January night. Why were US forces there, and what secrets does Tower 22 hold? Let's dive in. The Al-Tanf base played an important role in operations against the self-proclaimed Islamic State in the 2010s. Its more recent importance comes due to its location. Because this base sits near the highway connecting Baghdad to Damascus, the United States sees it as an important part of its strategy to contain an Iranian military buildup in Syria and prevent Tehran from realizing its Shia Crescent strategy, a bridge of influence stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. These are all areas with Shiite majorities or significant minorities. The revival of Shiite Islamist militarism is a major component of Iran's Shia Crescent strategy. If Al-Tanf falls, Iran will have an easy supply route connecting Tehran through Iraq and Syria, and then onto the Mediterranean through Lebanon. Hezbollah and other Islamist militants would then have a much easier way to be supplied. Tower 22 is only 12 miles from Al-Tanf, so it can act as a support base for special operations missions in both Syria and Iraq. Logistical support is one of Tower 22's primary purposes, and indeed, most of the personnel stationed there are support troops. This base also gives the United States an area of forward presence to monitor Iran's actions from friendlier territory, and Tower 22 has drone infrastructure to help it to do this. Satellite imagery also reveals helicopter pads on the base. The Tower 22 facility is part of a broader deployment of American forces to Jordan. About 3,000 troops are currently stationed there. The United States also trains the Jordanian military and conducts frequent exercises with it. Jordan has had close security ties with the United States for decades, and it's one of the largest receivers of American foreign military aid, with $1.2 billion in the latest disbursements. This figure puts Jordan behind only Ukraine and Ethiopia as a receiver of American military aid. Jordan has gotten over $20 billion in American military aid since 1951. From Washington's perspective, the aid to Jordan makes sense as part of a program to contain the spread of Islamist militarism in the region. For example, the United States spent $234 million between 2009 and 2021 to help Jordan set up an extensive border surveillance program to prevent terrorists from infiltrating the country and using it as a base of operations. For Jordan, the aid is a welcome way of keeping terrorists out of its territory. Tower 22 was established in 2015, primarily to help Jordan's military do just that after ISIS attacked a refugee camp within its territory. Also, the vast majority of Jordan's inhabitants are Sunni Muslim, so the Jordanian government would not like to see the Iranian Shiite Crescent become a reality. The alliance with the United States helps in this purpose too. The immediate background to the attack on Tower 22 came with the Hamas-led terrorist attack on Israel on October 7, 2023. This attack killed about 1,200 people. Hamas militants also took about 250 prisoners. Between this terror attack and the incident on January 28th, as Israeli military operations in Gaza ramped up, American forces in the region came under attack over 150 times by other militant groups. These groups were attacked by the Iranians and Syrians. The series of attacks caused at least 70 casualties. Although there were no American fatalities, there were a hefty amount of traumatic brain injuries, according to Reuters. American retaliatory responses against the groups conducting these attacks had been ongoing. These retaliatory strikes were especially pronounced against the Iranian-backed Houthi militias that threatened commercial shipping near the Gulf of Aden. However, none of these attacks between October 7th and January 28th came on Tower 22 or any other base in Jordanian territory. The attacks were against outposts in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. Even the Iran-backed militants did not want to risk the further escalation that would come with attacks in Jordanian territory. This lack of targeting likely created a sense of complacency at Tower 22. However, Jordanian officials seemed to understand that they couldn't rely on the good faith of the militant groups in Iraq and Syria to not attack targets within their country. In 2023, Jordan requested that the United States deploy Patriot systems to increase its air defense capabilities at the border. It also requested more help from Washington in the form of anti-drone weapons. This request came partially as a result of a little-known drug war raging along the border between Jordan and Syria. One of the consequences of the Syrian civil war was the creation of a robust illegal drug industry in that country. Syria was suspended from the Arab League in 2011 after the war broke out. In 2023, in light of military reality within Syria's internationally recognized borders, the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad was reinstated. However, one of the conditions for this reinstatement was for that regime to crack down on its drug producers and stop them from using Jordan as a transit point en route to their products' destinations in the wealthy Gulf countries. Jordanian officials have accused Syria of doing little to stop this drug traffic, however. Iran-backed militias are likely involved in overseeing this production too. Jordan has frequently needed to shoot down drones carrying drugs across the border. However, as the war in Ukraine has shown us, using expensive surface-to-air missile systems like the Patriot to shoot down much cheaper drones is a disastrous and unsustainable method of air defense. Although there's no evidence that Jordan intended to use the system in this way, no Patriot system was deployed to the Jordanian border, perhaps for understandable reasons. On the whole, the area around Tower 22 lacked physical air defense systems. Thanks to its remoteness and the tendency of the Islamist groups to not attack targets in Jordanian territory, the United States military likely did not see the need to deploy such expensive systems to that base. Again, the war in Ukraine has shown that these resources are limited, and military brasses must be careful about where they are sent. Tower 22 was likely not a priority. According to American military officials, the drone, a Shahed 136 that the war in Ukraine has made famous, hit an area near the barracks in Tower 22. The attack on such a specific target explains the high casualties and suggests a good level of intelligence about the base's layout among the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. The group carried out 2 more attacks on other bases in the same operation, suggesting it was well planned. The Islamic Resistance in Iraq may have known that the base had radar problems, which would have made it an enticing target. When contributing to a report in The Intercept released on February 9th, several service members who had seen deployments to Tower 22 castigated it for its lack of air defense systems. One airman who served at Tower 22 in 2023 said of the base, "The air defenses were minimal, if any. We relied heavily on aircraft from MSAB, Muwafaq Salti Air Base, to stop any targets. We had a radar system called TPS-75 that was broken 80% of the time I was there." The radar in question, the AN-TPS-75, is a 3D passive electronically scanned array (PESA) radar designed to conduct long-range search and altitude-finding operations simultaneously out to a range of about 275 miles and to a height of 95,500 feet. However, this system originates in the 1970s, and its planar array antenna must rotate to provide 360-degree azimuth coverage, meaning that it has blind spots. In fact, just 2 days before the attack on Tower 22, the Air Force announced its plans to replace the aging AN-TPS-75 with the new TPY-4, which has longer range, can pick up smaller objects, and has better coverage. The Washington Post reported that the troops at Tower 22 likely did not detect the incoming drone. The Post quoted an American defense official as saying that the drone was likely missed due to its low flight path. The official confirmed that Tower 22 did not have kinetic weapons capable of countering drones and instead needed to rely on electronic warfare systems. In contrast, a drone attack 90 minutes later on Al-Tanf was shot down by a Coyote UAV interceptor. The Coyote is an ideal weapon to counter incoming UAVs, especially on remote bases. This is why the US military is ordering 600 more of them in a contract worth $75 million announced on February 9th. On January 30th, the Associated Press claimed that Tower 22 did indeed have these interceptors on site, but this was as part of a report alleging that American forces had detected the drone and mistook it for a friendly object. We now know that this is false. Pentagon sources answering the Intercept's later report asserted only that Tower 22 had some kind of counter-unmanned aircraft system, but they declined to say what it was. This vague statement is consistent with the allegation that the troops on Tower 22 had only electronic systems to guard themselves with against hostile drone attacks. The problem of thin air defenses is more widespread than Tower 22. When speaking to The Intercept, another soldier deployed in Jordan who had seen service at Tower 22 reported that other bases in the area also lacked air defense measures, including against drone attacks. These comments suggest that American forces in Jordan had indeed developed a sense of complacency. Iran may have denied any responsibility for the attack at the end of January, but because the militias that it sponsored did announce their role, more hawkish members of the United States Congress like Lindsey Graham, RSC, called for a direct attack against the former. The retaliatory response on the night between February 2nd and 3rd did not go that far, but did strike over 85 targets in Iraq and Syria associated with the Quds Force and the militant groups that it supports. The Quds Force is the special operations branch of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and reports directly to the country's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. The operation that night involved B-1 bombers flown from the United States and other aircraft. According to the United States Central Command, which oversees military operations in the Middle East, more than 125 precision-guided munitions were fired in the airstrikes. Some of the locations in the initial strikes included command and control centers, 4 of which were in Syria and 3 in Iraq. There were a reported 34 deaths of militia members in Syria, according to the Syria Observatory for Human Rights, a group monitoring human rights issues in Syria that's based in the United Kingdom. State media in Syria also claimed that the airstrikes had hit a power plant that partially disrupted the Deir al-Zor governorate's power supply. These claims are obviously less trustworthy. An official from Iraq's Western Al-Anbar governorate said that houses used by Islamist militants as weapons depots in the border town of Al-Qaim were completely destroyed in the airstrikes. He also claimed that 2 civilians had been killed. Other Iraqi officials, meanwhile, said that 16 fighters associated with the Popular Mobilization of Forces were killed in a strike on the group's headquarters in the town of Akashat near the border with Syria. American officials said that the purpose of the airstrikes was to undermine the ability for Iran and its militias to conduct further attacks on US forces in the region. It was also important for Washington to do this in a way that would not tip the region further toward a wider conflict. Biden administration officials were adamant that they wanted to avoid a war with Iran. Were the attacks successful in both of these purposes, the Biden administration's Republican critics were quick to suggest that they were not. These politicians accused the White House of telegraphing the response ahead of time, and the operation was too limited to accomplish the goals that were set out for it. Democratic politicians were naturally quick to take the White House's defense. The strikes created some geopolitical tension. In a sign of how complicated the region is, the Popular Mobilization of Forces has official backing from the US-aligned Iraqi government as a paramilitary organization. This group played an important role in the fight against ISIS, especially in the early part of the campaign, when the regular Iraqi army had crumbled in the face of the terror group's advance. Despite both of these things, the PMF is also associated with the Islamic Resistance in Iraq and is officially designated as a terrorist organization by the United States. After the attacks, crowds in Baghdad gathered to mourn the PMF militants who had been killed, with people there chanting, "America is the greatest devil." The tension spread to the centers of power too, with the government calling for a reduction or end to the American military presence in the country, which currently consists of about 2,500 troops. But these airstrikes turned out only to be a prelude for the highest profile one. There would be an additional action in Baghdad a few days later. On February 7th, the United States conducted a drone strike which killed 3 more militants in a car. Among them was Abu Bakr al-Sadi, the leader of Kataib Hezbollah, one of the groups operating under the umbrella of the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. The Iraqi government condemned this strike as a clear-cut assassination operation. Despite the pains the United States took to limit collateral damage by using a purely kinetic variant of the Hellfire missile, the AGM-114R9X, which does not have an explosive warhead. Rather, this weapon deploys blades to kill its targets just before the moment of impact. Nevertheless, the Iraqi government spokesman said that the US-led coalition was becoming a factor for instability. The attack prompted another call for an end to the coalition's mission. In this regard, there was certainly some immediate blowback to the strikes. However, 2 months later, the strategic status quo in the Middle East remains as it was. There is no serious prospect of American forces leaving their bases in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan anytime soon. Perhaps more importantly, the intensity of the attacks on American bases in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan has dropped off dramatically. This comes partially because of a secret trip from a high-ranking Iranian military official. On January 29th, the commander of the Quds Force, Esmail Qaani, was visiting Baghdad. Shortly thereafter, the militant groups in Iraq agreed to scale back their operations. This was on both Qaani's request and the request of the Iraqi government, which specifically wanted to put a leash on the militants that had been responsible for the unusual attack on Jordanian territory. 10 sources revealed that Qaani had instructed the Shiite militias to keep a low profile, warning that any attacks which drew American blood would invite a much more severe response from the United States. Such retaliation would include targeted strikes on senior leaders within these organizations, he cautioned. One of the Islamist militant factions was reportedly reluctant to agree, but ultimately caved in. Between February 4th and the middle of the month, there were no attacks against American troops in Iraq, Jordan, and Syria. By comparison, there were over 20 in the 2 weeks before Karni visited Baghdad. Notably, Karni's warnings came before the airstrikes. That the American retaliation occurred on exactly the lines he predicted, with the targeted attack on one of the senior leaders in the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, must have strengthened his conviction that he made the right decision. The attack on February 7th recalled the much more famous but otherwise similar one on Karni's predecessor, Qasem Soleimani, 4 years earlier. This attack has left a lingering ghost on Iranian officials. Karni's January 29th visit occurred at the airport in Baghdad. He did not leave the airport and stayed only for a short duration for fear of his safety, not wanting to suffer a repeat of what happened to Soleimani in January 2020. Ultimately, America's swift counterstrike following the drone attack on Tower 22 marked a turning point. The rising tide of Islamist militia offensives, intensifying since October 2023, abruptly ceased. The deterrent force of US military power cast a long shadow, effectively achieving Washington's twin goals. This decisive moment underscores the strategic impact of a calculated response, proving that in the chess game of global politics, America's move was a checkmate against the escalation of hostilities. However, the airstrikes between February 2nd and 7th did not solve the longer-term geopolitical complications in this always complicated region. The Houthi militants that Iran supports continue to attack commercial shipping, despite heavy airstrikes from the United States and United Kingdom. These militants may also have begun to attack the underwater internet cables that connect Europe and Asia, as some of the cables in the Houthis' area of operations have recently been damaged. The Houthis have so far not claimed credit for this, but they did threaten to attack the cables a few months earlier. So far, internet providers have managed to divert the traffic from the damaged cables, but further damage puts connectivity at risk. Since the internet is used for everything from basic communications to financial transactions, such organized attacks would carry a far broader global risk than the Houthis' military power ordinarily warrants. More broadly, it's only a matter of time before attacks on American forces in Iraq, Syria, and potentially Jordan resume. Iran's pause in further attacks following Karni's visit to Baghdad is typical of the way it conducts its operations. There are periods where armed attacks ramp up, followed by periods of cool down. However, for Iran to realize its goal of creating the Shia Crescent, it must push American troops out of Iraq and Syria. Staging a direct military confrontation with the United States to do so is too dangerous for Tehran. But it can use its proxies to shed American blood and ramp up domestic political pressure to end the deployments of US troops to the region. This will remain Iraq's modus operandi. So long as Iran continues with its Shia Crescent strategy, new attacks at a later point in time are certain. The retaliatory strikes at the start of February may have succeeded in their purpose, but in broader terms, they only created a period of calm before the next storm inevitably comes. But do you agree? What do you think about the attack on Tower 22 and the airstrikes the United States delivered in response? Did they go far enough? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Now go and check out how the US Navy Seahawk helicopters destroyed Houthi pirates. Or click this other video instead. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to support the channel and get more military analysis from military experts.